Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Ash Owen, and I cannot wait to find moments of joy with you today. You know, one of my favorite things about doing these podcasts is hearing from you. Now, you can do that by giving us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can do that by jumping on to the Everyday Joy Facebook community group. Or the other day, I received the most beautiful text messages from one of our listeners. She said it was the first time she ever listened to the podcast, and it was a day where she was feeling super down. She said that she cannot thank us enough. The words that we shared were so beautiful. She said, "I love how encouraging and sweet you are. I wanted to thank you for brightening my spirits and bringing me closer to God on a day where I was feeling super scared and emotional." Thank you for sending this message through. These things are just what makes my heart so happy. I love hearing that you are loving the podcast, that it brings you those moments of joy when you're feeling really down. And so if you have a thought, if you want to share with someone how much you love our podcast, why don't you give us a review? Why don't you shoot us an email? Or why don't you share it with a friend? It's the best way that more people can find out about our podcast. I cannot wait for you to hear today's guest on the Everyday Joy podcast. So grab a cup of tea, grab your headphones, and let's get ready to dive into today's words to live by.
1 Peter 5:10. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you.
Now, I have maybe one of my favorite people ever in the room with me today. It is Ro. Ro, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello.
You jumped onto the podcast, was it late last year?
Yeah.
Late last year, you had your inaugural week of episodes, and now you're back. How are you doing?
I'm good. I was a little bit nervous last time coming in to be part of the podcast, but I'm excited. I think today's going to be great.
Now, today's verse, 1 Peter 5 verse 10, it says, "After you've suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you." I love this verse. I just think, I don't know, there's kind of two parts to this verse. At the beginning, it's like the Lord kind of goes, there's a little bit of suffering, there's a little bit of stress, there's a little bit of things not going how we had planned. But God is so good and God is so faithful that he himself will restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. I think that when I think about this, it's so true to my whole life, right? Like when I think about my life and I think about the lowest lows, the hardest circumstances of my life, those words of restoration and strength, they are what perfectly encapsulate that season after that terrible season, right? I don't know, it's so easy when we're in those really yucky times to kind of forget that God will do all these things, but God's never failed me. And when I look at my life, whenever I've gone through tough circumstances, where it be, finding a new job, or where it be going through a difficult thing with mental health or relationally or whatever it is, at the other end of it, there is so much restoration. It's kind of that, it reminds me of that verse where it's, God will give you more than you can imagine. It's that idea that when God restores, he doesn't just give it back to you how you expected it. When God restores, he restores because he heals and then he adds to it as well.
Oh, that's so good, Ash. I am so encouraged. I think we're done for the day.
Wrap it up there, guys. A 5-minute episode.
I think, like you said, the first part of this verse is about the suffering and the second part is about the restoration. And I think the good thing, nobody ever wants to suffer. We don't want to go through suffering.
It's not ideal.
And God doesn't make us suffer. But there are situations where in our suffering, we learn. We grow, we become better than we were before, whatever that situation or circumstance was. So I have got to a point where I welcome the suffering, and not sadistically, but I welcome those challenges. I'll take them as a challenge and go, all right, God, where's the win in this situation? And what are you wanting me to learn? How are you wanting me to grow? What are you wanting to do in me so that I can get through this situation and potentially help others who might have been in a similar circumstance?
You're so right. It's kind of like, I know in the times of my life when I maybe haven't been proactive at trusting God in circumstances, the waves of those difficult times are so overwhelming and they take you down so quick. It's like when you go through those seasons of being, I guess, in those suffering seasons, in those seasons where it's really tough, but you don't remember, I guess, the second half of this verse. It's so easy to be hopeless. It's so easy to allow the current circumstance to take away your hope, your joy, your excitement for the future. And I think that it's kind of, to me, this verse just shows me God goes, have hope. Like, I'm promising you this, right? If we believe who God says he is, if we believe that he's true to his promise, he is all of these things. So that after suffering, after struggle, after the valley, there will be restoration, strengthening. He will establish you. So it's kind of like, I guess for me, it's going like, God's character is to do all these things. God's character and heart for us is to strengthen us. And I like what you said there, where it's like, sometimes it's actually how he strengthens us in that season and how he grows us to deal with that season that is actually the good fruit of the difficult time.
Yeah, that's right. It's like how a diamond is made. It's made under pressure.
Totally.
So when it starts off, it's nothing special. We are special. Just let me put that out. We are special. We are created by God. But a diamond only becomes beautiful and precious after it's been through that pressure system.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, when we allow God to move in the circumstances that we're in, we just, like I said before, we just come out better off, stronger, ready to take on the next challenge. And there's been situations in my life. I mean, let's talk about grief for a moment. That's a massive suffering. And everybody goes through it. We all lose someone at some stage. And there were times in my life, especially in my younger years, where, you know, I lived a life outside of God's will. And I was in a situation where I think I was about 18 years old and I was pregnant. And at 26 weeks gestation, I had a miscarriage. I lost that baby. And 26 weeks, for those that might not know, is over halfway. So that's when you're preparing to, you know, have this baby and have a life and start a family. You start buying the clothes. You start setting up your nursery, all of that sort of stuff. And you just, your life is projecting, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. And then to hit 26 weeks and then lose your baby is heartbreaking. And it was my first pregnancy, and I was very young and I didn't know God. And so I went through that on my own. Well, was I on my own? I don't know. That's probably a conversation for another day, but I do believe that God is with us even when we don't choose him. So, you know, that was a pretty rough
That's
situation.
a lot to go through.
It's an emotional roller coaster. It takes a toll on, you know, who you think you are, who you think you go. What am I going to do now? My life is completely different to what I was expecting it to be and what I projected my future would be.
Wow.
So, and there's those times where you kind of stop and you take stock. And later in my life, knowing what I know now, knowing God, knowing who he is, he's taken me through journeys, and I might not have even known that he was there, but he's taking me through these journeys and brought me out the other side, because I can talk about these things, and there's been so many women in my life who I've connected with who have been in a similar situation, and I've had the opportunity to share my story with them, walk through their journey with them and help them come out the other side, knowing that God will restore, that he loves us, that he will, you know, use these situations for good, to glorify him, to give us life. He's such a good God.
It's so true. it's so incredible that you can reflect on that and see how God has been restoring. What do you think when you reflect on, I guess, that season of life, like, and you look at your life now, what is that moment where you're like, man, God is a restorer? Like, is there a moment where you could reflect on that?
I think I see it more now than what I did then.
Yeah.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing sometimes.
Totally.
Where I just go, I don't know how, but I actually know how.
Yeah.
I couldn't have done, and that wasn't the only miscarriage that I went through.
Wow.
There were multiple, and they were all in the second trimester.
Gosh.
So even, once I got married, and I knew God, and I knew that He loved me, those circumstances, that suffering can still happen.
Yeah.
And so I know now that God was always there with me, carrying me. You know that Footsteps poem?
I love that poem.
That is what got me through. Just knowing that He's carrying me. He's walking. He's doing the lifting. I'm just, laid out like a baby in His arms, and He's carrying me.
Totally.
Because I couldn't have carried it on my own.
I absolutely love today's episode with Ro. I hope that out of today's episode, you are so comforted and so assured that God is with you. No matter what circumstance you're walking through, like Ro said, the Lord wants to carry you. He wants to walk with you through it. And if you've never heard that poem before, the Footsteps poem is such a beautiful depiction of God's love and heart for you. In this poem, it talks about a man who's going through a difficult circumstance. It says he doesn't know where God is in different moments of his life. The poem says when the last scene of his life flashed out before him, he looked back at the footprints in the sand. He noticed that many times along the path of his life, there was only one set of footprints. He also noticed that this happened at the lowest and saddest times in his life. This really bothered him, and he questioned the Lord about it. Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you would walk me through all the way. But I've noticed that during the most troublesome times in my life, there is only one set of footprints. I don't understand that why when I needed you most, you would leave me. The Lord replied, my precious child, I love you and I will never leave you. During the times of trial and suffering, when you only see one set of footprints, it was when I carried you. I hope that today's episode filled you with hope, joy, and I pray that the rest of your day is filled with moments of joy. We cannot wait to unpack even more words to live by with you tomorrow.